We chose the theme of thresholds long before this current pandemic changed life considerably. And now it turns out to be a very important theme for this time. A tipping point is a kind of threshold when change stops being incremental and tips over into major change. Tipping points are often caused by small or remote actions that then have a sudden and significant effect. A tipping point can be a point of no return. Or I'll draw on my math background and point to what are called discontinuous curves or functions. When graphed, these curves look very ordinary until, for some set of values, the curve suddenly drops or stops. The freezing point of water is one of those tipping points. At 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, water freezes. Have you ever forgotten a bottle of water or soda in the freezer and took it out only to watch it suddenly and quickly turn to ice? Melting in the other direction is often more gradual. In child development, there are a number of tipping points, thresholds that are passed and that suddenly create other great changes. One of them is learning to walk. Another is catching on finally on how to learn to read. I quoted Malcolm Gladwell in the opening quote. His book on tipping points 20 years ago popularized the concept and term. He was then especially interested in explaining the rather unusual and steep drop in the crime rate in New York City after 1990. What had happened? He also looked at culture and style trends. One I keep thinking of is, how did that Macarena suddenly become such a craze? Many of the explanations in Gladwell's book, it turns out, don't hold up. For instance, he credited the broken windows policy in New York for the fall in the crime rate, but little backs that up. Yes, they happened around the same time, but correlation is not causation. Other cities had sharp falls about the same time without that policy. Another question with tipping points is, how many people does it take to change a culture? That's not a light bulb joke, it's serious. How many people have to adopt a change for it to then suddenly and precipitously become a craze, or a trend, or a majority opinion? Lots of social psychology studies have tried to answer that question. The tipping point number seems to be somewhere between 10% and 40%. 25% shows up in one major study from the University of Pennsylvania published in 2018, and I'll use that number. 3 years ago, we had a speaker at our society who offered his experience with and study of countries that had successfully turned dictatorship back to democracy. That speaker said there is a tipping point. Predictably, he said, it's when about 5 to 10% of the population turns out in mass public demonstrations. Just 5 to 10% actually in mass public demonstrations. A committed minority, once it becomes large enough but is still a minority, has enormous influential power. That committed minority can make a variety of social change demands, not all in the same direction. Social change can be social justice. Social change is not always social justice. A committed minority did get most of us to look at sexual harassment and sexual consent in different ways. Some now are trying to build a committed minority to influence behavior changes that protect the environment and influence climate change. A committed minority can also create a culture of internet bullying and acceptable out-and-out white supremacy racism. The Chinese government uses the tipping point theory to intervene in social networks in China, planting and promoting pro-government propaganda, shifting conversations away from social unrest. We are at a tipping point today. This pandemic has made clear that the economic system of this country does not provide economic security for the overwhelming majority of citizens. Even before this crisis, last year, a survey showed that more than 70% of Americans had less than $1,000 in a savings account. In almost every category, single people with children have the least savings. The 2008 recession wiped out the savings and net worth of many families, hitting families of color especially hard. But now we have seen a sudden crisis that puts far more stress on the system. Australia is mourning that their unemployment rate has hugely jumped due to the coronavirus, all the way to 6.2%. Here in the US, it's actually about 20%, according to experts, and could rise as high as 25%. Our economic system is not working. And so there's a lot of unrest as people try to promote change they think will reduce their own risk and or the risk of others. And we've also been facing a not so sudden and drastic and visible form of crisis with climate change. The way we've been living is destructive. The tipping point for climate may be 1 or 2 more degrees Celsius of warming, after which it will be difficult to impossible to recover a climate amenable to human well-being. The vast majority of scientists, digging for the best answers that they can find, agree that the actions of humanity are pushing us towards more warming and towards that tipping point. We don't like to think about tipping points. We like to think in gradual continuities. We don't like to think that one sick person attending a funeral could mean 50 people sick and 5 or more dead within weeks. It is easier to be in denial. But if a few more each week are willing to face it, change can happen. This coronavirus in our culture is a little like that small impurity in the water that at the freezing point suddenly and quickly crystallizes the water around it. Or maybe on a less drastic level, it's like the economic disaster in a family at the edge after the car breaks down. There's no money to fix it, but there will be no paycheck without a car to get to work. One small change crystallizes many others. Because of the tipping point effect, one study estimated that it takes almost 20 years without any financial setbacks or crises for the average poor person to rise out of poverty. The Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, an African-American Buddhist, wrote this a couple of years ago about facing change in our culture. She was writing about climate change, racism, an economy that isn't working. She wrote, "There is something dying in our society, in our culture, and there's something dying in us individually. And what is dying is the willingness to be in denial. And that is extraordinary. The willingness to be in denial is dying in a meaningful number of us, the tipping point. It's always been happening. And when it happens in enough of us, in a short enough period of time, at the same time, then you have a tipping point and the culture begins to shift. And then what I feel like people are at now is, no, bring it on. I have to face it. We have to face it." That's Angel Kyoto Williams. We have a couple of choices here at this tipping point. We can face it and let denial die, or we can let denial thrive, keep doing pretty much what we were doing, sacrificing the well-being of many for the enrichment of a few, even moving into what Naomi Klein calls coronavirus capitalism. Jeff Bezos may become the first trillionaire. And meanwhile, he fires executives who question his treatment of the workers who make that trillion possible. Among my treasures is a handwritten $10 and change refund check dated in 1994. I misplaced it for more than 90 days after I got it, so I never cashed it. I had ordered online in the early days of computer connections. Some guy was selling books online out of his garage. He ran out of what I ordered, so he personally wrote me a $10 check in handwriting on his personal checking account as the refund. The signature? Jeff Bezos. His company didn't always hold the sway in our economy that it now does. There was a tipping point on the way up, and there could be a new tipping point deciding that his profits are predatory and monopolistic and against the public interest. We are part of an interconnected system. We had a lot of impact as consumers and workers making his billions. We can have a lot of impact as activists and voters, making sure that he can't hoard the profits at the expense of the well-being of the society that created his wealth for him. Even now we can, and I think we must, become part of a committed and increasing minority of voices in creative ways. Do we continue to pour money into sustaining industries that are no longer viable? Billions in subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, which could not survive without government help, while mocking individuals who ask for subsidies to pay rent and buy food when they are among the 20 to 25% of workers now without a paycheck. This is our opportunity as citizens to be part of a tipping point. I don't know about you, but I was indoctrinated at school that the value of capitalism was to increase the standard of living for all. The USA is nowhere near the top at the standard of living. We can demand that the economy be rethought to provide that decent standard of living now and in the future. You know, the economy originally meant how we manage a household. It's how we manage the household of humanity, all of humanity. Will we finally see that tying healthcare coverage to being employed is, how can I best say this, delusional, and considering the racial disparities, maybe even genocidal? Those of us with steady incomes, compassionate and sustainable employers, Social Security checks, etc., we are not immune from these effects. A quarter of the population unable to pay bills means the rest of the economy, that household of humanity, is also at risk. It is a true tipping point. And like the climate, we may not be able to recover any semblance of an economic system that is able to do its job, effectively and efficiently manage the human household's work and goods and services. We need, I believe, to be part of that vocal, committed minority of at least 25% of Americans actively promoting the values that will tip the scales towards more equity, more well-being for all. Values that the majority say they are for, but are not committed yet to promoting and actively supporting. When I lived in Virginia, there was a time when the then president was rumored to be about to appoint some federal judges who were horrific on church-state issues. I was part of a small group of diverse clergy visiting our senator's office to tell him why he should oppose these appointments. Some of the ideas we presented, and that his aide was furiously writing down that day, were in the statement that the senator issued 2 days later, when he brought together a coalition of enough senators from both parties to say they would not support these judges, and they were not appointed. Larger actions with many coming together make a difference. Small actions can also crystallize a change, and they make more change when they are concrete and repeated. I wanted our friends from Action Corps to give their status report today because they are telling us an important story. This society created maybe 20 letters to our local congressman, who also happens to have a powerful committee seat in the House of Representatives. Whether we support that congressman or not, we as constituents have a power and responsibility in speaking our minds. And it turns out those letters may very well have made a difference. So I leave you to consider, as you watch the news of what sounds like disaster, what tipping points do you see? What small acts can you do to push that tipping point in the direction of respect? Respect for the dignity and worth of all, not just those who already have wealth and power. To take small actions consistently. Write letters to decision makers. Vote for people who will make better decisions. Help others get out to vote. Build movements. In 2018, it was demonstrated clearly that getting a personalized postcard even from a stranger in another state, increased the chance that the recipient would vote. And those movements, be part of creative demonstrations, like recent ones some of you attended with caravans of motor vehicles. Change your buying habits. There is just so much that we can do, and be building that 25% committed and vocal minority that will, at some point, crystallize others to join and become the necessary active majority. I will close with these words by writer and poet Sonia Renee Taylor. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than that we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature.